I'm Philip Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of the Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition. We are currently celebrating our 50th anniversary, so we've been around a long time. We have been celebrating it by hosting a series of talks, and in the case of tonight's event, panel discussions about the coastal region in very basic ways and looking at the fundamental issues that and the challenges that we deal with, which is to say we haven't been spending the time looking back on the last 50 years, but looking forward to the next 50 when we hope to be around and continuing to work to protect the coast that we love. Oregon Shores is a comprehensive conservation group, by which I mean we at least potentially tackle all the types of issues that affect the coastal region. We work on land use planning, we work on water quality, endangered species, shoreline management, marine conservation, anything that our members bring to us as a local concern. We work with citizens in their communities to help to make decisions that affect those communities, both natural and human. We're perhaps best known for our Coast Watch program, through which volunteers adopt a mile of the shoreline and monitor it, and which also sponsors a number of citizen science projects. We can always use additional volunteers for Coast Watch to help watch over the shoreline. Our Coast Watch volunteer coordinator, Jesse Jones, is with us tonight as the ghost in the machine, helping to actually make this happen. If you'd be interested in helping us care for the Oregon coast, I'd certainly urge you to go to our website, oregonshores.org, and learn more about what we do. We would love to have you join us for the next 50 years. And one particular note, one way to help us aside from joining or contributing is to participate in our currently ongoing auction, also celebrating our 50th anniversary. In fact, this would be a good time to visit that because it's a rolling auction, and a number of the items, in fact, are coming up for their final bids tomorrow, October 1st. So there's still time to get in on those. To reach the auction, again, go to oregonshores.org and you will see a button for the auction right at the top of the website. So our panel tonight is a way of digging deep into those issues that we deal with. We work to protect the entire Oregon coastal region, as I said. And, we often speak in terms of preserving the coast that we love, but that sort of implies that the coast has always been the way we found it and we want to keep it that way. The reality is the coast we're working on now has been transformed in many ways by human activities in the last couple of centuries. And our panelists tonight will be looking at that through various lenses. By the way, the panel was organized by Oregon Shores board member Ed Joyce, who in fact is a geologist who's very familiar with the way that the coastal landscapes are altered. So thanks to him for developing that. And our moderator tonight is Ernie Nemi. He is the president of Natural Resource Economics, which is a consultancy based in Eugene, and the co-director of the Forest Carbon Coalition, a national organization which works on climate smart forest management. Very much appreciate his guiding us through the rest of tonight's event. And with that, I'll hand it over to Ernie.
Thank you, Philip. Again, I am Ernie Nemi. I'm going to moderate this. I'm going to try to keep us on schedule as best I can. I just want to point out that Jesse Jones has given a web address in the chat. So if you are having any problems, we don't anticipate problems, but if you are having problems, you might contact her and see if she can help you sort them out. We have three presenters tonight. The first is Bill Robbins, who is an emeritus distinguished professor of history at Oregon State University. The second is Scott Burns, who is professor emeritus of geology at Portland State University. And the third is Paul Engelmeyer from the Portland Audubon Society and the Tenmile Creek Sanctuary. And if any of them want to give more about their background, they can feel free to do so. We're going to begin with Bill, and then go to Scott, and then go to Paul. And the format is each will speak for about 15 minutes. Then there will be a very quick Q&A that generally will be a question that I will pose. And then at the end of the three presentations, we will open it up to the audience at large. So with that, Bill, take it away.
Thank you, Ernie.
All
And,
right. I am here. I'm going to pull up Bill's presentation. Just bear with me for one moment here.
And that is the wonderful Jesse.
Hello, everyone. Okay.
Thank you, Jesse. My presentation is going to be to offer up a larger description of the Northwest region in terms of its peoples over time, its ecosystems, and so forth, and the transformation of those ecosystems in the last 170 years. The area that I'm focusing on extends from Northern California to coastal Alaska. You can see the map on the screen of the what is referred to as the Northwest Coast Temperate Forest. Its dominant species include Douglas fir, most of you are familiar with, red cedar, Sitka spruce, and western hemlock. And in a sense, it's a natural geographic system, or if you wish, a greater ecosystem. I want to point out a historical note that in terms of European intrusion into this part of North America, it is relatively recent in comparison with the expansion of the European presence across the globe. And so, as I referenced earlier, a time frame of about 170 years since the Euro-American presence became dominant. This has meant for historians, archaeologists, and others, an abundance of documented evidence revealing change, and that is demographic, cultural, biological, and ecological change. Archaeological excavations, for instance, revealed copious evidence revealing change and about indigenous peoples. You can go to the second slide, Jesse. This reveals incredible information about dietary habits of indigenous people, fish, shellfish along the coast, herbs, berries, terrestrial animals, and so forth. On the Oregon coast, especially in the region we're addressing tonight, there is a plethora of language groups and tribal peoples, more numerous to mention that I'm going to refer here tonight. But it's that indigenous world that was relatively stable for 10,000 years. Think of that. That was abruptly disrupted beginning in about 1800, but especially during the 1830s and 1840s. And this is a transformation that I have called in writing the Great Divide. The elements of that transition were grounded in human tragedy, smallpox, measles, epidemics, and then in 1830, for the region we're dealing with this evening, in 1830, seasonal malaria epidemics between 1830 and 1833 that killed 90% of the indigenous population. And you go to the next slide, and I'm going to read from the screen. These are old world contagions. The reoccurring malaria epidemics were devastating to Indians along the lower Columbia River, the Willamette Valley, and in villages on Oregon's coastal estuaries. And then in a striking letter to Hudson's Bay Company officials in October 1830, Chief Factor John McLaughlin estimated the native death toll in the vicinity of Fort Vancouver of 75%. And of course, we know much more about that contagion in the present day. That's a shocking demographic catastrophe. And the epidemic diseases thinned the native population at a critical period in the region's history. And that is the onset of a great demographic and cultural shift, introducing dramatic changes to ecosystems everywhere, not only along the coast, but in the interior as well. And the newcomers who came brought with them revolutionary new cultural values and a host of new species. And they brought with them values that principles that treated the natural world as capital resources that could be turned to profit in the market. Fish, animals, trees, and the land itself could be turned to value to improve one's status in life. And if you turn to the next slide, please. This is an example of a wheat field viewed from a hill overlooking part of the Willamette Valley in the Eugene area. And what happened in this transformation is that Euro-Americans, and I'm going to quote here a famous line from historian Richard White, they husbanded the familiar. That's a direct quote. Transforming landscapes into settings of familiar plants and animals. And this example here of wheat on the old prairies of the Willamette Valley. From the 1840s through the 1880s, spectacular and systemic changes were brought not only to the Willamette Valley, but to the coastal region as well. The catalyst for these changes began with the California gold rush and shifting subsistence living patterns to commercial activity. Euro-Americans quickly realized the market value of coastal fish, shellfish, and trees. And if you go to the next slide, this is called for a short period of time, Oyster City and Yaquina Bay. Oyster companies coming to Yaquina Bay in the early 1860s, exporting oysters to California, to the San Francisco Bay region. But on a larger scale, the development of the lumber business, which paralleled all of this activity, led to the greatest degree of ecological disruption. California lumberman, and you can go to the next slide, Asa Mead Simpson established sawmills in several places along the North Pacific coast, including the Coos Bay region, to capitalize on the timber in those areas to be manufactured, sawed into lumber, and sent to the California market. Nothing was more disruptive to ecosystems in the Coast Range than logging. And this was especially true with advances in technology. And my one instrument, one citation that is the most disruptive of all was the coming of steam, first to sawmills and then in logging operations. And the steam-powered donkey, if you go to the next slide, introduced in coastal forests beginning in the 1880s, and then in the areas outside of California and along the Oregon coast in Washington, in a very quick period of time, the steam donkey introduced in coastal forest replaced bull teams in yarding logs. In other words, bringing logs usually to waterways where they could be floated to markets. Excuse me. Steam vastly quickened the pace of activity in the woods and disturbances to ecosystems. My favorite quote, and this is one that I've shamelessly borrowed in much of my writing, is from a Grays Harbor lumberman by the name of George Emerson. And I'm going to read this quote. It's an unbelievable statement. When one considers that steam donkeys require no stable and no feed, that all expense stops when the whistle blows, no oxen killed, no teams to winter, no ground too wet, no hill too steep, it is easy to see they are a revolution in logging. Now, the steam donkey, on one point, greatly increased log production. On the second point, it dramatically disrupted forest ecosystems, riparian areas, and so forth. And all of the character, in other words, of waterways flowing to coastal estuaries. And what I indicate is the steam donkey represents the machine in the forest. The donkey engine is the beginning. The diesel yarding machine that followed, logging railroads, log truck roads after the Second World War, clear-cut practices, all these increased log production and escalated disturbances in Oregon's coastal streams. The negative costs were large. Landslides and erosion. We should go to the next slide. Yeah, we're going to have to skip to the next slide. This is what happens when I ask people to forward slides because I forget to remind them. Go back to the previous one. Because this is the kind of devastation caused by steam donkeys and disrupting forest landscapes. But getting to the next slide now, Jesse, landslides and erosion. And if you'll note on this map, it's a relatively recent derivation, the density of landslides on the south coast. And you can see in the figures on the right-hand side of your screen, the lowest rate of disruption and then down to the bottom. And the darkest of the colors, of course, is the lower Oregon coast, the southern coast. So that's the impact of landslides and streams. And I should add that, and if you can move to the next slide, this is the kind of effort that the aftermath of logging operations where no effort was made to protect riparian areas. And this, of course, created a lot of disturbance to streams and so forth. And in the long run, of course, it heated water that flows to the ocean and affects anadromous fish runs. In the wake of this activity, in the years after the Second World War, the introduction of 2,4,5-T, other herbicides, although 2,4,5-T was eventually banned, affected all life forms, humans, animals, and of course the watersheds themselves. Now, these environmental disruptions that I've addressed affected entire watersheds and estuaries. You have to remember streams flow downstreams, and a water biologist who was familiar with work on the H.D. Andrews experimental forest and the Mackenzie River watershed developed a scheme called the river continuum. In other words, that when we study estuaries, we need to consider the upper drainage of streams. Let me focus now briefly on estuarine environments themselves. And there were production-driven strategies similar to what happens in the woods affected estuaries, which were subject to the same kinds of industrial changes. There were 22 large estuaries along the Oregon coast. Most of them were altered to dredging to deepen ship channels. And you can see here, this is the channel going into the Coos Bay estuary. And I don't know what the depth of the channel, but I remember in a book I did on the Coos Bay region, the argument was for 40 feet on the entrance so that shipping could enter and exit peacefully and without damage. Estuaries filled over time, were filled, if you go to the next slide.
Okay, and we are just about, Bill, at the 2-minute mark, okay?
Yeah, and I'm wrapping it up. Altered dredging and shipping channels and so forth, but filling in estuaries for commercial development. And this is a scene, I think, of Garibaldi. That's what I'm told, in the northern part of Tillamook Bay. You can see the flat areas out there where there's industrial development are probably filled in areas. Diking for multiple purposes was another example, livestock grazing that affected estuaries. And here I'm suggesting a model, the restoration of the Salmon River estuary south of Cascade Head, where the removal of dikes and restoration of salt marshes has been underway for several years. An incredible estuary restoration effort. For larger and more developed estuaries, like the Quina Bay, of course, the undertaking is, in fact, one that will probably never be overcome because of the use of such estuaries as storage areas. You can move to the next slide. This is the Salmon River estuary, and now move to the next one. One of the greatest disruptive factors in the Coos Bay area has been logging. Logs floated down streams and so forth. And there have been homes built, homes for aquaculture enterprises and so forth, estuaries filled with pilings, docks, and bridge supports. So water quality is affected by all of those. And I want to close with one final comment that I haven't addressed, and that is the elephant in our story, and that is confronting the future of coastal environments in the age of climate change. I thank you.
Thank you, Bill. That was excellent. I'm really glad that you went first. That was a great presentation. One of the things that I'm really glad that you emphasize is the impact on landslides. And just by coincidence, in the 30 minutes before I came to this, I came across a notice of new research published today where scientists have identified through using special techniques more than, quote, more than 600 slow moving landslides in coastal Washington,
Yes.
Southern Oregon, and Northern California,
Yes.
that were not previously known.
Right.
And again, those are slow moving so far, but who knows what's going to happen when you start to see the full effects of climate change materialize in this region. Bill, if I may, I'd like to go back and ask you this question. Because I think I heard you say that the transition occurred in the 1800s when in-migrants brought new cultural values that viewed resources as being important because they could be converted to dollars.
That's right.
Now, do those cultural values persist today? Have they been changed? Is there any hope that they are going to change, and so we're not going to continue to see the trends and the processes that you described continue in our future?
Well, I think that every step that is taken to restore estuaries, to protect riparian areas and streams involving development and so forth, addresses that question. And it is an ongoing struggle that continues in the present and will in the future.
Okay, excellent. Again, I'm the economist in this group. So for those listening in, I would like to point you toward a report that was published within the last year, published by an economist named Das Gupta for the British Treasury Department, Treasury Ministry, and it's the economics of biodiversity. And he highlights that we have a climate crisis. We also have a biodiversity crisis. Bill has touched on that and what's happening within the Coast Range. But Das Gupta, using data from around the world, says we have so adversely affected our ecosystems that the return on investments in conservation and restoration have to give us very high returns on those investments, as opposed to the return on continuing to degrade those ecosystems. And the return on conservation and restoration is at least 4 times the rate of return on continued logging, continued destruction of these ecosystems, a continuation of the processes that Bill just described so very, very well, a continuation of the slide that is on your screens right now. Bill, any last words that you'd like to say before I switch to Scott?
No, I think you better move on to Scott. Thank you.
Okay, Scott Burns is the Professor Emeritus of Geology at Portland State University. I understand, Scott, you do not have slides. So we will be pleased to share views of you.
Okay, we're ready to go. And Bill, absolutely great introduction there. I just loved everything you had to say about this. I'm going to take us back a little bit in time for the last 25 million years and then work up to where the coastal system is today. And so the coastal system that we have, and anytime we talk about the ecology, we have to ask, what's the basic geology and where did the geology come from? And so you've got the coast range, which is intimately attached to the coastline. And so very, very important, what is happening in those two? Where did the coastal mountains come from? Where did the coast range come from? Well, the northern Oregon coast range, most of that came from basalt flows that flowed all the way across the state of Oregon from a hotspot, which is now today underneath Yellowstone National Park, but came down the ancestral Columbia River and then flowed to the coast. All of the major headlands that you have, Cape Lookout, Cape Cascade Head, Yaquinta Head, all of those are basalt flows that came across between 15 and 18 million years ago and then solidified as they went down off of the coast into the muds. Also, you had that old hotspot was actually off of the coast originally and created huge amounts of basalt that we call siletzia. And that was the bedrock that was there in the system. And then you had lots of sediment that was coming down the ancestral Columbia River, and you would sometimes have sands and sometimes silt, sometimes clays. Those sedimentary rocks that were created from that were in this area off of the coast of Oregon. Then you started having Cascadia happen. That is the movement of the plate off of the coast towards North America, and then it would be subducted down underneath North America and then uplifted all of those sediments, uplifted the heart of the coast range, which is siletzia, and then the basalts on top of it, and then all of the sedimentary rocks. And it continues today, and it's moving about 4 centimeters a year underneath North America. And so we have lots of earthquakes. We also have an uplift of all of those sediments out of the ocean that you got. Southern Oregon, different story. You got the Klamath Mountains. Those are very, very old rocks down there. And those have all been uplifted also because of Cascadia and the Juan de Fuca plate, and then the southern margin of that uplifting everything. So the coast is continuously uplifting, creating erosion. And what happens is every time it rains and water comes into the mountains, you're going to have sediment that is going to be generated in the streams, and that sediment is going to come down. And then if you have landslides, those landslide sediments are going to come into the streams, and then every time it floods, that sediment is taken down to the coast. And so and then what happens is the fine-grained sediments, the silts and the clays, are going to go out into the oceans, off onto the Astoria fan, but then the sands stay in the system. So all the sand that is up and down the coast is going to be coming out of the rivers. So what is happening in the mountains is going to create what the sand is on the coast. And then we have all these headlands, Cascade Head, Tillamook Head, et cetera, Yaquinta Head. Those form what we call cells. And the sediment, as it comes out of the rivers, will move between those headlands, back and forth. Some moving to the south during the wintertime, some moving to the north during the summertime, and it moves back and forth. And so the coastal ecosystem is dominated by the sediment that is coming out of the rivers because of floods and landslides and things like that into the coastal area. And then it moves back and forth and back and forth. Now, when we had, and Bill talked about the extensive erosion that was occurring because of logging in the coast range, and then along the coastline, all of that sediment that was going into the system went down into the coastal systems, added more sand to the system. A lot of that sediment also went off of the coast, but then It was problematic because you had incredible erosion of those slopes inland, especially. And so that is the system that we are dealing with. We also had major forest fires, and maybe some of you remember the Tillamook burn that occurred and the burns that occurred between the 20s and the 50s. There are 3 to 4 of them that were there. I still remember planting as a kid. I'm a 6th generation Oregonian, planting trees in the Coast Range as a result of that. And so we had a lot of erosion that was occurring. Back in 1996, we had a huge rainfall event that hit the Pacific Northwest. We called it the atmospheric river, or the Pineapple Express. And for instance, in the Portland area, we mapped over 700 landslides that occurred in the Portland area, and many, many landslides in the Coast Range and down in the Klamath Mountains and along the coast. You had these. Lots of sediment came down. A lot of that went back to forest practices. And so we rewrote the Forest Practices Act after that. And they said, look, in these areas that are clear cut, we got to be very, very careful, because some areas are just highly prone to landslides. And so now the forest practices say, before you go in and do a clear cut, that you have to say, where are the old landslides that are found in this area? So the scarp areas where the old landslides have been, you can't log those, because those are going to be highly prone to landslides, and also the toes of the landslides. Secondly, the areas along the river, you got to leave the trees along there to intercept the sediment that is coming in. It was just, Ernie just mentioned about the 600 landslides that had been discovered just recently in the Oregon Coast Range and all the way up in Washington. Those are all found by LIDAR, the godsend to landslide specialists in the Pacific Northwest. Our 2 states, Oregon and Washington, they're all my students that are out there doing that, mapping those landslides using this laser imaging that you can see through the trees, and you can see the old headscarps, you can see the toes and where the landslides happened before. This is good news for us, because what it tells, if before you log an area, if you're going to use the technique of clear cutting, you cannot log the upper areas and the lower areas of it and the areas along the streams, therefore reducing the amount of sediment that is going into the streams. Now, some of those landslides are good because they give sediment into the streams that become the areas where you get the salmon coming up and laying their eggs. And some of those gravel bars that are there, they're all a result of the landslides. So landslides are not totally bad that we have in those areas. And then along the coastline, we have a much better understanding of the movement of the sediments within these cells. One of the most famous, and Bill Robbins, I know, has to know about this, one of the most famous sites on the Oregon coast is the ocean, the city that fell into the ocean. And they did not understand the movement of the sediments up and down in that cell there in the Tillamook Bay. And you have the Tillamook Spit there. And it was Oregon's first destination resort that was developed, started back in 1906. And then, but by 1950, all of the houses and the natatorium, Olympic-sized natatorium that were built there, all had eroded into the ocean. Why? Because they did not understand the movement of the sediments. Army Corps of Engineers built a jetty down there instead of 2 of them, and it intercepted the movement of the sediment. It was moving in a southerly direction, starved the sediment to the spit, and it eroded away, and everything fell into the ocean. So I think we are in a lot better condition today because we understand the movement of the sediment up and down. We also are doing a much better job of the Forest Practices Act, trying to reduce the amount of landslide material that is going into the system. But then, as has been mentioned, you've got climate change. And as the climate is warming, what is going to be happening with probably increased storms, these magnitudes of these Pineapple Expresses coming in, we're going to see some major events that are going to be occurring there. And so more landslides, more sediment movement into the coastal areas, and then movements up and down the coast too. And then, so those are some of the things geologically that I wanted to mention. Some positive things that are happening, but then also some negative things and potential that are there in the future. And so those are some of the things that I wanted to mention. I love the bill mentioning the river continuum from the mountains all the way down into the coast, the coastal areas, and very, very important. And I think that people have a much better understanding today of this whole thing than we had one time in the past. So I'm going to end there and see if Ernie has any questions for us, and go from there.
Okay. Again, I'm just sitting here smiling to myself about what great presentations these are, and I hope the people in the audience understand the wealth of expertise that Bill and Scott are bringing to you today. Scott, if I may, I want to go back to of course, to Bill's elephant. And you highlighted that we should expect the Pineapple Express or whatever, these big storms coming towards us, and their potential interactions with the geology that sits out there. Do we have information now that tells us where the high risk places are? So for example, do we know on the lower parts of some of these streams and rivers that some of them are more likely to feel the effects of rainfall interacting with unstable sediments or unstable materials, and seeing the kind of floods that, for example, they saw in Germany this last summer? Do we have that information?
We're working on that. And a very important act was passed by Congress very recently, and that's the National Landslide Hazard Map. And so they're putting money into mapping landslides from coast to coast in the United States. It's one of the last major hazards that you cannot buy insurance for. And so that is part of that. But what they are doing is commissioning each one of the state geological surveys to go ahead and map all the landslides. Now we have this incredible tool, LIDAR, which we can, where were the landslides in the past? And then we are taking it to the next step. And then when we see these landslides, what's the age on them? And so if we get students out studying these particular ones, are the age relationships? Now, landslides in Oregon, in the Coast Range, for instance, have two sources. Number one, rainfall, major rainfall events. The other one, Cascadia, and the big subduction 9.0 earthquakes that occur. And now we're trying to put some of those stories together. And so where are the potential prone areas? What you do is you map all the landslides, look at all of the ages of them that you have got, and then you put together what we call a landslide potential map. And you're going to see a lot more of those going on. One of my star students, Bill Burns at Dogami, our state geological survey, is doing that for Oregon. And then another one of my ex-students is doing the same thing for the state of Washington, their geological survey up there, and that's Kate. And so I think with time, we are going to know where are the problematic areas that we have got. And so there's good future.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Just to follow up on that, again, as the economist, one of the ways that I think about climate change is I'm not skilled enough or trained enough to talk about the effects on geology or the effects on climate per se, but I think about it in terms of the risks that are created by those changes in climate or changes in ecosystems and rainfall and the like. And so given that climate change and the biodiversity crisis increase risk, can you talk about some potential changes that we ought to be making in our legislation, in our decision-making, in our forest practice rules, in our road building, in our location of housing and the like, anticipating that risk in the future is going to look a lot different than risk in our past?
And you mentioned one very, very important thing. First of all, with the Forest Practices Act and the revisions that we had at the end of after 1996, we took care of a lot of those things. But one major elephant that is in the room right now are all of the logged areas and the roads that are in the Coast Range. Major problem. And what we find is that if the roads are not maintained, That is, the culverts get clogged up. You get a lot of rainfall coming down. You end up having landslides on those roads. And then what happens is you have a lot of increased sediment going into the streams. And so now our state Oregon Department of Forestry and the U.S. Forest Service are trying to decommission a lot of the roads in those particular areas, especially in areas where they're not going to be logging in the future. But they still have a long way to go. And there's a lot of private land. Now, some of the companies like Weyerhaeuser are very proactive, and they're out there and saying, what are the conditions of the roads and things like this? Because if we have increased water coming in, we're going to have increased landslides, and we're going to have increased problems with this. But there are a lot of private forested lands that are out there that the companies do not have that culture to do that, or the money to maintain all of the roads. So maintenance of roads is a big, huge thing right now that I think that we need to take a look at in the future.
Okay, Jesse, how are we doing on time?
Hi, sorry, I'm here. We are at time for
Okay.
Scott. Thank you, Scott.
Okay, well, one final thing, Scott, is there any last words, as it were?
I think I've said an awful lot. So thank you very much for the chance to talk.
Thank you. I really do appreciate it. Now, Paul, you're up.
Okay. See if we can get this full screen. Okay. So can you see that okay?
Yeah, there we go. There we go. Now we're at full screen. Perfect.
Okay. So I've got a lot of slides, a lot of visuals, and I'll walk you through it all very rapidly, knowing that this will be recorded. And so, and you should consider me a resource. And so it's been interesting that Scott, William, and myself really didn't brainstorm on how we do this sequence here. So I bring you closer to the present from basically 200 years to the present. So this is actually pretty interesting, just by chance. And so I'll be talking about the historical perspective from basically 200 years ago and loss of old growth, and a key issue that we're dealing with, Clean Water Act, and then walk you through some of the natural resource issues that are pertinent right now, coho recovery, marble murrelet, and natural climate solutions and 30 by 30. So everybody's kind of probably heard this guy, McLeod, an adventurer, explorer out here 200 years ago at the mouth of Beaver Creek, which is about 8 miles south of Newport. And that's where he set up camp and continued to take beaver pelts. And so it was an ongoing extraction, okay? And then when we got into the timber, it was the next big ticket extraction, but there was one in between that was very critical. But as those things were moving forward, we have a list of declines from pelicans to whales, peregrines, eulachon, butterflies, the whole routine, martin, estuaries, one after another of decline of species and key habitat types. Some places like, I believe it was William mentioned the Salmon River estuary. This is a photo from Duncan up there in Salmon River, one of the tribs. Here's Alsea Bay, affected, loss about 65% of the tidal marsh. But I'm going to get into the Clean Water Act. And this is a teaser for me because I came into this issue from an activist, basically being working all over Region 6 as a worker until I decided to stick a flag in the ground on the Central Coast and be a part of recovery, protection, and restoration. Back then, as you can see, that's a steelhead with a fin clip. That's how long ago it was. And you could keep those, but the decline was very real. But here's the thing that gets me is that this idea of significant impacts to the environment. I don't know if you know Kelly or Joe, but they're really good. And here's a good paper. And this was really one of the key first big widespread anthropogenic disturbance. It's splash dams and log transport in the rivers. As you can see, the brown are actually dams, splash dam, and the what looks like rivers are actually log drives. And this was the way to transport this commodity down to the estuaries. Okay, I can't get it to move forward now. Oh, there we go. Okay, and this is what it looked like. So let's riff. I'm going back. And this was just outside of Yachats, spruce, Sitka spruce. And then we jump to 1970s, the Clean Water Act came into play, 13 parameters were identified. And so splash dams affected water quality, logging did, ag did, everything. Everybody knows we have a problem with salmon. Salmon are listed under the endangered species list. Most folks aren't savvy to the fact that every one of our rivers are on the 303D list as water quality. So now we're struggling with a TMDL, which are total maximum daily load. How do we improve those conditions? So that's the new territory of what is in play right now into the future. How do we recover these watersheds? And then you lay on this issue of climate change and this storm events that are going to be big storm events, and then dry features like the driest April on record. Here's a data set from 1950 that up to the present and talks about these dry seasons and and how much is going to be in the system. This is terrible news for spring chinook, summer steelhead, and rearing salmon. This is on the horizon as a result of climate change. And then these stream flows. So we had never seen stream flows like this all summer. And so this is maybe the new normal. And for the folks who aren't savvy to riparian zone, I thought I'd just put this in there to make sure that you see what I'm talking about when we think about riparian zone and forest corridors and just the reality of how much work we have. And we continue to make mistakes, allowing folks to be moving, building, roaded areas in this riparian zone. And so one of these issues that photo of myself and my son, that's called a beneficial use under the Clean Water Act. Same way with the shorebird eating the sculpin, or the shellfish, or the recreators, or the fact that in the Alsea Bay, we had 5 canneries. They were done by 1930. And you had these Chinook that were in the zone of 60 to 80 pounds. So that means they were probably 5 and 6 year olds. That's a life history pattern that we as the humans had exploitation rates have changed over the set of decades because we powerboats, we could go fish them in the ocean, catch them in the ocean and bring them back, as opposed to them making multiple loops in the Pacific before they come back. It's a life history pattern that we basically took out. And so you've got them coming back at a younger age. And then here's Brian Booth, State Park. That's the photo of the McLeod. That's where he stopped. And that's where he extracted beavers. And that's why it's called Beaver Creek. And so this human change issue is we, Wetlands Conservancy, we Watershed Council, we state parks, we state national forest, we the Wildlife Refuge are all embarking on these recovery strategies. How do we protect and how do we restore? So the Siuslaw and state parks and Wetlands Conservancy have a program that's moving forward in the state park. And upstream with private landowners, dealing with invasive species, in-stream projects, a list of actions. And of course, we get to this next issue that from my perspective is one of the other key elephants in the room that we, McLeod, was just trying to make a living, coming out here exploiting the pelts. And so now we've got, oh yeah, they're present at this really localized extirpation or not functioning abundances. They're present, but we continue to allow trapping. And there's a link on this at the end of this presentation that'll get you into this discussion about the value of beavers and what you can do. And so it's no question in many of our mind how valuable they are for protecting water, winter flows, habitat complexity for salmon recovery, natural storage of water. Water is going to be and is a already. And so, and this issue isn't going to go away, and beavers are a part of the solution. There are climate and carbon benefits. You've got books, you've got policy direction, salmon recovery strategies, 11 recovery plans, all point to beaver being part of the solution. And then this other part of the solution, what we found is that we formed the Mid-Coast Watershed Council 25 years ago. And when we founded, there were other watershed groups forming. Now there's about 60 around the state. There are people that are willing to work. They're not so much interested in working with the federal or the state government. So there's a niche. This Watershed Council stepped up. It's an opportunity to engage, and many of us are engaged in it. Working on projects, cleanups, invasive species control, facilitating acquisition and restoration in our communities. This is the part of the landscape. I deal with about 1 million acres, and this block here around Yachats, and I can't remember who it was, Scott, talking about the littoral cell from Cape Perpetua to Asita Head. That's a landscape unit, basalt headlands, again, in that 15 million year zone, basalt headlands, with 2 wildernesses in the Audubon Sanctuary in the middle of that, and highest concentration of murrelet in the state. And we were talking about roads. And so for us to participate with the Forest Service in watershed analysis, the idea of posing the question in the watershed analysis about roads impairing watershed function, then you as the public get an answer from the federal government. And then when they say, well, this road impairs the upper portion of the basin, the way we set the road up 45 years ago, we should decommission that road and 3 bridges. If you as the public know the question, get it into the process, you can decommission a road like we did here in Cape Creek, which is the little trib that enters at the Hasita Lighthouse. Now we've got a mini roadless area there. That's an example of what you can do if you choose to engage. And then this Clean Water Act, EPA, NOAA, I work with Nina Bell, and so there's a fact fiction. You get a lot of folks posing questions about how good Oregon is, reality check. Here you got 2 pages fact fiction on this, just a reality check of how much work we have ahead of us. And then we get into the marbled murrelet. I was fortunate enough to be on the murrelet research team, climber, photographer in the upper canopy, the old growth. And that was in the late 80s, early 90s. And we helped facilitate the ESA listing on federal as well as state. And here are the issues: habitat loss, fragmentation, predation of 70+% of the chicks fail because of crows, ravens, and jays. So these are issues of long-term recovery of multiple species. We do citizen science efforts, much like the Adopt a Mile program, and we've been doing that for 15 years, getting folks out in the field to show them murrelet going into the forest and then doing surveys on the ocean as well. Here's an example of a nest cup up at, the average nest is about 150 to 170 feet. They're on those nesting platforms like that. This Douglas fir here had the top blown out probably 45 years ago, 30 years ago. Those lateral branches have a hormone change that they then turn and go up. And then that nice big fat branch has nice moss on it. That turns into a nesting platform for a marbled murrelet. They don't build a nest, they use the moss mat. And here's our landscape here from the top of Cape Perpetua, and then from the ocean looking back. And then these edge effects are very real. Industrial lands adjacent to public lands, there's blowdown, it's very real. There needs to be a strategy to deal with that. So you can see the little marker of federal lands there being blown over, and then federal land being just unraveling as we speak. And we get to salmon. the same sets of issues, water quality and stream complexity. Every one of these watersheds point to the same things: stream complexity, water quality. This is stream complexity as a result of a restoration project. It creates refugia for the fry, as well as traps some of that substrate, the gravel, for high quality spawning and rearing habitat. And then you ask the next question: where does the wood come from? It comes from unstable slopes, natural processes, but you have to leave the trees on those type N streams, non-fish bearing, unstable, that we can map out with Dogami. And so these ideas of working with private landowners, making sure that they leave the unstable, rules have to change. Ecological process is the strategy. That's where we're going. That's what we need. The good news is ODFW, as a result of many of us drawing attention to the overharvest issue, you can see it was 60 to almost 90% of the run they were killing intentionally on ocean and freshwater until the legal challenge in the 90s, and some of us drawing attention to the flaw there. And now we're hovering at anywhere from 10 to 15%. That was a big deal. And then here's an interesting fact about these dippers. This is a photo from a friend up in the Elwha, taking feather and looking at, are there marine-driven nutrients above the dams in the Elwha? They did pre and post, and then they found out that after the dams were open, you'd actually have marine-driven nutrients via eggs and carcasses in 4 years' time. This is an amazing short period of time to see recovery. And so for us to invest in education, getting folks engaged, this is what we're doing. This is Beaver Creek again, where McLeod landed and then exploited Beaver Creek 200 years ago. The Siuslaw is on the change as a result of the Northwest Forest Plan policy direction. Those legal challenges for the owl were very successful at changing the trajectory. And so they're working in plantations. We're trying to influence them to be a little more conservative, but it's definitely better than the clear-cut management regime that were in play. And this is industrial lands and private lands. These are opportunities for acquisitions, connectivity, and working with private landowners on strategies. You can see this little tributary pushed over to the side. This would have been forested wetland beaver complex right up Beaver Creek here. So this is at the headwaters from where McLeod landed 200 years ago. And there's an example of unstable slope that could have easily been mapped and said we shouldn't put the road there and shouldn't log that. Instead, we get sediment. Here's another road of decommissioning, flawed process, edge effects. And then here's the road decommissioning I mentioned. 4 miles of road and 3 bridges as a result of us engaging with the Forest Service, fish biologists, and the wildlife biologists. And I can't leave a few of these species out of the discussion. The lamprey on the top and the eulachon on your left. And to me, you've got a species that are in the 400 million year zone. And another one, the eulachon, some folks think that Oregon was named after that anadromous species. So these are in a research project that's going on since 1990 in Tenmile Creek. I think I've got to keep moving here. And this is part of our community science thing, looking at murrelet in the near shore. And this is a big acquisition that was in our conservation target since the 80s. And you may have seen the book, Saving Big Creek. But this is what the game was like for a set of decades. And then we get into the beginning of discussion about coastal wetlands and climate and carbon. New territory, and this is the new game. And so here are some links that all you need to do is download this presentation, click on that, and you'll get these different papers on natural climate solutions, human dimensions, blue carbon strategies. And this is one of the other footprint that I get to deal with is with Wetlands Conservancy Pool Slough, which is a tributary of the Yaquina Bay. So whoever it was that mentioned Oysterville, that is just as Pool Slough hits Yaquina Bay over there in the upper right corner. And then here's Alsea Bay, a big oxbow. And here are some of the issues related to natural climate solutions And these are things that we're doing. 40% of what we need to do is improve the way we treat the land. Longer rotations, restoration on damaged landscapes. These are all carbon storage strategies. And so it's a co-benefit piece. There's a couple of papers there from Christy DeBella down at Point Blue that are really good at a roadmap for this piece of a multifaceted carbon climate strategy. So type N streams on your right with that waterfall, non-fish bearing stream, log over it, spray over it. It's not right, it's wrong. And yet we do it under existing forest practices. Ag practices need improvement. And this is some folks that I get to deal with. Not right now because of COVID, but for the last 12 to 15 years. This is the forestry crew out of Angel Job Corps. That's the next generation of foresters that I get to influence about 6 to 10 times a year, being out in the field at land I manage. And then these are some habitat type and species that are in the state's conservation strategy, which is a good document. If you haven't seen it, I urge you to look at it. And for the Coast Range bioregion, as well as the Willamette Valley and anywhere if you're outside this different parts of the state. And some more background. So and we are looking for more supporters related to this beaver conservation effort. Jump onto that link there, and you'll get opportunities for engagement. And these are the OPB special on the timber wars. And this third one here, Silet's logging animation. It's not for the weak of heart. It shows you what has been happening just from 84 to the present. And it shows it in about 30 seconds. Like I said, it is not for the weak of heart because it shows what has been going on our landscape. And then these other videos are from U.S. Fish and Wildlife that are Miralat. And then there's the conservation strategy. And then we get to 30 by 30, which may be a good opportunity. We hope so. And we are trying to make it hit the ground with some community engagement meetings that we're having on the Central Coast about identifying opportunities to nominate locations. And these are 8 principles that are based in this initiative that's in play. And we describe it more of a ridgetop to reef strategy. And so uplands, estuaries, as well as in the nearshore and marine reserve area. And some more links related to the Miralat. And climate in Oregon's industrial forest by Coast Range Association. Again, another link that I urge you to check out. And these are just some of our partners. These are people that are engaged. We're not going away. And we've got to engage because there's so much work to do. And that's that's the Salmon River estuary there and Beaver Creek natural area in the bottom. So let's see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Paul. There's an awful lot to digest there. As you indicated, you did that on purpose because there's an awful lot for people to know. And I appreciate that you provided easy links for people to follow. And at the end of all of this, Jesse will again make it clear of how you can get access to that material. So I'd like to again go back to what Paul said. And my notes indicated that he said that there was nothing more harmful to the ecosystem than logging, especially as you first brought in the steam and then the other machinery. Well, we see an awful lot of logging taking place in the Coast Range. So is it possible? One skeptic is that as long as we have that amount of logging taking place in the Coast Range, that all of the conservation restoration efforts are really just nothing, they're just distractions. Another view, though, is that that's the only way that we can come back from the effects of logging. So can you talk to us, where are we between those two endpoints?
That's a really good question. It's hard for me to, I guess I find myself, to be honest, everybody knows I'm an advocate. How hard do you poke someone in the eye as you still continue to try and affect change at a basin scale in your community? So I look at our watershed, the needs that need to happen, acquiring land from a large timber company, doing a conservation easement on someone who loves their land but wants to keep it. And so it's an educational process. But Charlie Dewberry, a fish bio who's done work, some of you may have heard of him, he described it back in the early 90s when we dropped the ESA petition to protect coho as it was death by 1,000 cuts. We were talking right at 50 to 60,000 coho coming back from 1.8 million. And if it wasn't for us dropping the ESA petition and acknowledging that they were on a death spiral and the agencies were not doing much, to be honest. And so for us to say, oh, we can add large wood here and trap some gravel and make some refugia, that's an emergency measure. That's what Charlie and us engage in. And we need to do that with willing partners. And so for us to be saying, every one of these, basically all I see is work out there, planting trees. When you have bedrock as a result of something that happened decades ago, literally decades ago, maybe even 100 years ago, and it's down to bedrock and you put large wood in, it traps gravel basically in the first and second storm event. Is it worthwhile to do that as you fight rules change, stronger buffers and unstable slope protection? I think yes. These are death by 1,000 cuts, and we're going to be healing as much as we can on ag lands and timberlands, and beavers are part of the solution, changing the rules there. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's how I take on it.
Well, it was a trick question, Paul, because I don't believe that there is anything that you could answer in 60 seconds.
Right.
Okay, Jesse, I believe you have received some questions that you are going to facilitate. And just letting people know, you can reach Jesse through the chat at the bottom of your screen, through the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, or through the raise your hand feature. And Jesse can try to get back to you. Jesse, if you run out of questions from the audience, then I have several that I can follow up with all three of the presenters.
Okay, wonderful. So if the panelists would like to turn on their videos, those who are speaking tonight, so all the panelists, feel free to turn on your videos, and I will make sure that you have that access. And while we're waiting for that, let's see, so Bill and Scott, I'm going to ask you to start your videos. Thank you. Okay, so we did have someone ask a question and then he had to leave, but it's a long, good question. So he's not here, but I thought this would be good. I don't know if you've seen this. I'm going to read this. Given the summer scorching of trees by the extreme heat wave from Newport to the northern tip of the Olympic Peninsula and beyond, and last year's historic Labor Day fires, and the extraordinary extraction of timber from private lands occurring today, combined with the fact that nurseries will in no way be able to provide a sustainable source of replant seedlings, shouldn't we be screaming for a pull on the emergency brake on all logging until all of this can be fully understood? From what I have seen, every logging yard or mill that I have driven by appeared to have a 2-year supply of log on hand to keep employees and the market happy. So does anyone want to take that?
I'll offer a tentative example, a tentative response. The scorching of trees is episodic. That's usually has happened on south slopes and so forth. And the larger story about the scorching of trees is associated, of course, with the heat dome that settled over the Northwest in the late month of June this past summer. The Labor Day fires of 2020 were unprecedented in their scope. They were anomalous events that happened that were unprecedented in Pacific Northwest history in terms of their scale and scope, east wing fires. And what I would say is these so-called anomalous events are going to be part of our future. They're going to become the new normal. And I don't have a specific answer to the question, but I think that it's those kinds of considerations. Expect the unexpected in the future. And that's something that we're going to have to wrestle with, whether it be sea rise associated with climate change, whether it be having some correction to do with logging roads in the mountains, which are the major cause of landslides, not logging. Logging can contribute, but it's logging roads that create the circumstances that lead to most landslides. Some landslides are natural, but logging roads accelerated the rate of landslides. So it's those kinds of activities, perhaps, that should be slowed in the future. Thank you.
If I may follow up on that and address this to all three of you, because Bill, you said we need to expect the unexpected. Can each of you address what you know from history or from, you know, the geologic science or from your advocacy work, Paul? How do we get Oregonians to get ahead of the effects, the risks, the catastrophes that we can expect from climate change? Or is that impossible? Will we be stuck responding to these catastrophes and we can never get ahead of them?
Were you asking me?
I'm asking all three of you.
Well, my first response would be, first, are we talking about the Coast Range bioregion? Yes or no? And then if it is, all indications are 80 to 90% of the fires are human caused. How many programs do we have with small woodlot owners, with neighborhood associations? I like a burn pile, but the fact of it is that this year having a burn pile in spring is stupid. And it took draconian measures to get that in people's head in the Coast Range. So we do not have a really good program. I've watched a number of presentations on fires when you posed the question that 80+% are human caused, including electrical lines, including fires, including a list of things are us. We've got to deal with that piece. That's the easiest thing to deal with. And we don't have a program for that.
Scott, Bill?
I wanted to make one comment. I just wanted to, Bill had a very, very important thing about extreme events and the two major extreme events he mentioned there. All the climatic models with increasing temperature around the world all agree on one thing. You're going to have more extreme events, whether it's colder, warmer, more rainfall, less rainfall, more hurricanes, less rain, hurricanes, more tornadoes, less ones for the whole world. And so these extreme events, the two that Bill mentioned, we're going to be having more and more of those, and we need to be more prepared for those. There is a consortium that is here in Oregon between the hydrologists at the University of Oregon, Oregon State, and Portland State. And they get together and they are doing climatic modeling in an increasing temperature. What do we expect down the road? And I think that this is very important for all of us, that a lot of these models that they're working on right now, at this point, they're saying we will probably have similar amount of rainfall and precipitation in the future, but it's not going to be coming in the wintertime. It's going to be coming earlier in the season and or later in the season. And as a result, we have good stream flow coming from our melting of our snowfields and our glaciers in the mountains, especially for the salmon in the fall. And we are not going to have that if all of the water is coming earlier in the season and instead of later in the as snow and ice. And so I think that these are going to be major things that we're going to have to deal with in the future.
I want to add a comment about modeling. Fire scientists in 2018 published a major online study of the Sierra Nevadas, of the Pine Country in Eastern Oregon, eastern Washington, and the area is never subject to fire, whether it be natural or human-caused fire. Lightning strikes, of course, are a perennial threat in an age of climate change. But what this modeling study that was published in 2018 suggested was that the areas west of the Cascade Range, the wet country, rain country, and so forth, would be less prone to the extremes of fire danger. And in a book that I published on the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest that was released in mid-September 2020, made a similar argument. And as I told an audience in Bend a couple of nights ago, when I picked up the books on my doorstep that were delivered, fires were burning all up and down the major canyons of the watershed in the Western Cascades, including 3 of the experimental watersheds in the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. So that is kind of the unexpected that we anticipate, that fire scientists anticipate. And that's the future that I think is difficult to predict. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jesse indicated that I should continue to try to pick your brains, so I will. I want to come back to beginning with Scott's 25 million years to Bill and Paul talking about the last couple hundred years, and Scott talked about the last couple hundred years as well, is if you can, from your different perspectives, talk to us about who were the winners and the losers over the last couple hundred years. Who are the winners and losers now? And so what? Should we try to help the people who lose from this environmental degradation and the like? And Scott, I know some people might think, well, you're a geologist, what do you know about this? But I disagree very strongly, because you are working with the scientists who are trying to give us this kind of information. So I would appreciate it if each of you would talk about, so what? We have different groups out there, and in the early 1800s, when the Europeans came, why they converted things to money, and it was wonderful. Except that 90% of the indigenous people died. It wasn't so wonderful for them. So where are we now? What do you anticipate? Thank you.
Want me to take a shot at that?
Whoever is brave enough to go forward.
Well, this idea of exploitation, you just put up a timeline, throw a dart at it, and go, okay, who's winning there? Well, the folks in San Francisco and Seattle were eating our oysters, okay? When San Francisco burned, they built that with our Douglas fir. We built airplanes with our Sitka spruce, and the fish crates in Alaska were built with our beautiful clear Sitka spruce. So we have been nonstop exporting our resources.
Okay.
And from my perspective, poke a little eye here, we had exploitation rates of 60, 70, and upper 80%. That's mismanagement. And, but of course, folks went to the bank with those exploitation rates of those hatchery fish were produced by the public money. We got to catch them. We're going to exploit them. They went to the bank. And so that was just the reality of the day. And so there's nonstop exploitation in the Coast Range. Very little of it stays.
Okay, Scott or Bill?
I'll just add a comment on winners and losers. And obviously, in the past, we can say that indigenous people, even beyond the incredible losses to diseases that were old world diseases that they had no biological immunities to, even beyond their incredible death rate. They were losers throughout the 19th century, confined to reservations. Their cultural means, whether it be language, practices, and so forth, were denied and so forth well into the 20th century. And I think that in the late 20th century, Oregon now has 9 tribes in which are to exercise a good deal of autonomy. However, in places like the Klamath Basin, where you have the Klamath tribe on the upper basin and 3 tribes on the lower basin, the issue of water is critical. And it appears at this point, although the tribes were successful through the Endangered Species Act and so forth, and holding off water from the Klamath Reservation because of lack of snowpack in the mountains, that ultimately their existence is in peril. Their cultural existence especially is in peril. And I have one final comment to say about salmon. And this is the long story about the overfishing of salmon scooped out of the Columbia River and everything. I grew up as a kid in Connecticut during the Second World War. And in the years immediately following the Second World War, my family didn't have much money, but we had a wonderful source of protein food, and it was canned salmon from the Columbia River that was cheap for working class people in the industrial East, and we could consume that, and my mother made salmon loaf and so forth and so on. Well, that was a short-lived enterprise, as we all know, because the building of dams on the Columbia River brought a huge reduction in the production of salmon in the river. But it was both the dams and it was incredible overfishing, seining fish out of the river and so forth. Anyway, that's not a pretty story. There are lots of losers there. That's all I have to say.
I would just like to just mention back to the winners and losers. Number one thing, our 2 states of Oregon and Washington, I think, have legislatures that listen. And organizations like Paul's, the Wetlands Conservancy, and the also the other organizations, listen when we go to the legislature, and I've seen that happen. And another I think set of winners are the indigenous people. The awareness that has come up in the last 10, 15 years of indigenous peoples, Black Lives Matters and stuff like this, they have a bigger voice. In Tualatin, where I live, we are putting together a visitor for the ice age floods. It's going to also be what were the people living here at that particular time and how they have, the Kalapuya, how they have lived here through time. Awareness is very important, and I think that all the indigenous people are going to be part of the conversation more in the future for everything that we do. But then also, I just think that I've seen our state come through with rules and regulations that have been very, very positive. And so I have a positive thought for the future for Oregon and Washington doing the right thing environmentally in response to climate change and also the pressures on the environment of logging.
Okay, thank you. And this may be the final question because we're down to 7:25 right now. Just before I came here, I came across an article that this is a 25th anniversary of the publication of a book by Blaine Harden, The Life and Death of the Columbia River. And in the interview, he makes the point that in the last decade or so, control over the Columbia River has shifted from the communities and the economic interests of Eastern Washington to Microsoft and Amazon in Seattle. That those 2 corporations, now among the biggest in the world, want that power. And so increasingly, the Columbia River is managed to satisfy those 2 corporations. Are we likely to see something similar happening to the forests of the Coast Range? One possibility that has been suggested is that as we become more globalized, there will be more of a global interest in extracting our wood products. And so the control will continue to shift from locally owned mills and property owners to Wall Street owned mills and property owners to globally owned mills and property owners. Or alternatively, that as the value of carbon increases, that more corporations will want to store carbon in the forests of the Coast Range. And so we will see a shift from exploiting wood products to exploiting carbon credits. Do you have any insights in any of those trends and expectations?
I'd like to respond just quickly, Ernie. And one of the big problems, of course, is the increasing hold that Wall Street corporations have on private forest lands in the Pacific Northwest. And as most people are aware, the real estate investment trusts that Wall Street companies are investing in, buying up forest land and so forth, is a real threat to how those forest lands, private forest lands, are managed, the degree of control that states have over the regulation of those forest lands and so forth. That is going to be an ongoing and I think increasing threat, even in the age of climate change and the repurposing of those forests for carbon sequestration. Thank you.
Okay. Paul, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, carbon sequestration is a big deal for the future. And Bill mentioned about planting trees as a way of carbon sequestration, and which is very, very positive. So I'm just hoping, I hope that in the future that we will do the right decisions using the data that is being collected out there.
Paul?
Sure. When we did the Northwest Forest Plan, I was the one who helped map priority areas, LSRs, late succession reserves, and gave it to the Gang of Four. But we didn't have access to drawing lines on private land. So again, back to our bioregion, we could easily design multiple species, carbon conservation areas at a bioregional scale. So you'd get a marbled murrelet, spotted owl, and a suite of species that would benefit from those interior forest protection mapping and assessment. And then you'd have that designed in a way that would be credible, and it would be funded through the carbon money. To me, that's really a part of the solution. We have farm bills to deal with 15-year strategies on private lands, and yet we do not have those really in place to deal with larger landscapes and carbon. So they've done a couple of big ticket items in Alaska, carbon acquisitions. We have not really, other than, I shouldn't say that, Pacific Forest Trust has done a number of those projects in California, and they've got some lands in Oregon as well.
Okay, so on that note, I think the three of you have answered the question I've asked from several different directions of how do we get ahead of what is coming towards us with climate change and with the continued exploitation and extraction of resources from our forests. And so I'm going to turn this back to Jesse and close this down. Thank you very much to our three panelists. You could not have been better. I really do applaud your both your knowledge and your willingness to share your knowledge with us in easily understandable ways.